We are live now.
Great, thanks Christina. Well, good afternoon everybody and welcome to today's town hall, which will focus on voting in the 2020 election. We're living in a time when confidence in the efficiency, security, and integrity of our elections is at an all-time low, with many Americans concerned not only about their safety due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also about how they will vote in November and whether their vote will count. Here to discuss measures to improve voter confidence, ensuring that Americans feel safe when they go to the polls and confident that their vote will be recorded, are the chief election officials representing Iowa and New Mexico. The Honorable Paul Pate, Iowa Secretary of State, who traveled on ACYPL exchanges to China in 1989 and to Chile and Brazil in 1994. And the Honorable Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, New Mexico Secretary of State, who traveled on an ACYPL exchange to Cuba in 2015. Secretary Pate, a Republican, is currently serving his third term as Iowa's Secretary of State. Prior to this, Secretary Pate served as the served in the Iowa State Senate for 6 years, beginning in 1989. He was first elected as Iowa's Secretary of State in 1994 and was elected as mayor of Cedar Rapids in 2001. During his tenure as the mayor of Cedar Rapids, he served as president of the Iowa League of Cities. He returned to the Secretary of State's office in 2015, 20 years after he was elected to the same position the first time. Secretary Pate served as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State from 2019 to 2020, a position now held by Secretary Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, who became president of the association this summer. Prior to her election as New Mexico Secretary of State in 2016, Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, a Democrat, was appointed to public office in 2007 when she became county clerk of New Mexico's largest county, Bernalillo County. She was then elected to her first term in 2008 and continued to serve 2.5 terms as county clerk up until she was elected as Secretary of State. In addition to her elected position, Secretary Toulouse-Oliver serves as a board member of New Mexico's Public Employees Retirement Association, the New Mexico Martin Luther King Jr. Commission, and the State Commission on Records and Archives. She is a member of New Mexico's Complete Count Commission for the 2020 census and is currently a W.K. Kellogg Foundation Community Leadership Network Fellow. Secretary Toulouse-Oliver and Secretary Pate, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you here today, especially so close to the election and during voter registration month. I'd like to begin our discussion today by focusing first on your work at the National Association of Secretaries of State, or NAS as I'll call it, moving forward, and the national efforts to prepare for the election in November. Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, as the current president of NAS, could you speak to the mission and work of the association?
Sure. Well, first of all, Jacqueline, thank you and ACYPL for having us here today. I wish we were able to all be on some amazing, interesting, and exotic travel this year, but obviously that's not in the cards for any of us right now. And frankly, as Secretary Pate and I were briefly chatting about beforehand, this election has just required all hands on deck. And so the travel probably would have just made things a little bit more challenging for us to try to get our jobs done. So as you mentioned, I'm currently the president, and I came into the position right after Paul in terms of our organization, NAS, the National Association of Secretaries of State. It is the nation's oldest nonpartisan professional organization for public officials. And one of the main things that we do in NAS is that we serve as a medium of exchange of information between states, and we foster the development of public policy. So coming together on a truly bipartisan basis. In fact, all of our officer positions regularly rotate between the Democratic side and the Republican side. We have bipartisan co-chairs of every single committee, and we really work hard to make this a true bipartisan organization, and to be able to find areas of interest that we can share our best practices with each other, our lessons learned. And I would say the number one issue that we have been focused on since 2016 has been cybersecurity and protecting the integrity of our nation's elections. And I know that Secretary Pate's probably going to speak a little more to that.
Yes, thank you. And I see that together you co-chair the NAS Cybersecurity Committee, and Secretary Pate, during your tenure as president of NAS, you were recognized with the association's NAS Ideas Award for your efforts to strengthen election cybersecurity in Iowa. And so, could you speak to what changes you made in Iowa?
Sure. Protecting the integrity and the security of our state's elections requires a massive team effort. In our case, we worked with our county and state and federal partners to ensure Iowa's election infrastructure was protecting in all 99 counties. And this was, as Maggie mentioned, not the top priority until just the last few years. And we quickly had to develop more talent, skills, and resources. And in June of 2018, we had about a quarter of our Iowa counties that were using the cyber services that we provided by our state's IT division. And that clearly wasn't enough. So we took a county by county approach to make sure every county was protected with some type of systems, so that by election day in November, all 99 would have at least one cyber program. And we were very pleased that we got well beyond that. And now we have all 99 counties who are using almost the full menu of services, whether it's pen testing, whether it's various protections from hacking on their websites. Those are all being done. Our next phase is just bolstering our cyber maturity, because it keeps evolving. We've had to do tabletops, and those have been very efficient. But working with Homeland and FBI and National Guard cyber teams, these were all pieces of what we put together to be able to do it. And we do it every day, and we'll keep doing it that way. We've had such a great improvement in our relationship with our partners, and that's where our strength is. And now we move to the next phase.
Thank you. And Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, understanding that 50 different states have 50 different laws and policies around voting, could you speak to common efforts by you and your peers across the country since 2016 to secure our elections, and maybe specifically in the space of cybersecurity?
Sure. And, to your point, we have these 50 different election systems. I mean, obviously, elections in America all have some consistent threads, no matter where you are. And as we learned in 2016, and of course, during the 2016 general election, that was my last election that I ran at the county level, and then came literally right into office in late 2016 to serve as Secretary of State. And just as I walked in the door, came to find out that the challenges that were experienced with cybersecurity, and in fact, the threats that were identified, had not been very well communicated down to the chief election officers of the state. And so I sort of walked into this whirlwind that I didn't really fully understand, because there I was in my county, kind of just, putting my nose to the grindstone, doing my piece of the equation. So what I quickly found out when I walked in the door to NAS at my first meeting was that election officials across the country were frustrated. They were feeling like they didn't have enough communication or information to be able to communicate with their constituents effectively, and more importantly, to be able to address the threat, right? And of course, as we've learned over the course of the last 3.5, almost 4 years now, there have been active foreign threats, and they have taken different shapes and forms. And so what we've done together collectively as an association, and as Secretary Pate mentioned, in collaboration with our federal partners, particularly DHS and FBI, is we've created a wonderful set of communication protocols. Every chief elections officer and our key staff have become cleared in terms of having security clearance to receive threat briefings and all of the information that we need to protect our systems. And we have all taken advantage of a lot of the tools and resources that are provided to us by the federal government, because the reality is, yes, there may be some domestic and even state-specific threats to our election security, but this is an overall threat to critical infrastructure of our country, that is our election systems. And we need and are dependent upon that partnership with the federal government to help combat that threat.
Thank you. Secretary Pate, anything else you want to add on the subject of cybersecurity?
I can't underscore enough what Maggie has said in the fact how far we've come in our communication and relationship with the Department of Homeland Security. It was a bumpy road initially and a lot of frustration. A big part of it was vocabulary too. That sounds kind of silly, but in talking with the federal government who deals with one type of security component in our language in elections, we were very sensitive to times when they throw some terms out there like hacking and say, now let's be careful about that because no one hacked a single vote. They may be messing around with trying to get into some voter registration lists or things like that. And that's a big thing to us because public confidence in our elections is so crucial. So we don't want to mislead voters into thinking their vote has been jeopardized or tampered with. So that was a big step. Just last week, Homeland Security helped us conduct an incident response plan exercise with all of our counties. Well, that's important. And this isn't the first one we've done. We've done many of these with the Homeland Security, but our counties appreciate that too, because we're only as strong as our most local, smallest point, if you will, and those counties are on the front line. So we have to get all this cyber to them as well, and not just for us at the state. All that is, to me, the key thing. And my colleague in Minnesota had a quote that I love to use, and that election cybersecurity is a race without a finish line. And every state needs to take this issue seriously, and we do. Every day we get up and we ask. I just had a cyber meeting this morning. I'm telling my county auditors before election day, you will all be on a .gov for your website. And with 99 of them, it's a real challenge to get them all there. But we're going to do it, by gosh, because we think that's going to be one of those battle fronts that we're going to be fighting this November. So we're doing great things, but you just don't rest on your laurels.
Yes, well, and this was something that perhaps safe to say you had a little bit of time to plan for. Something that no one planned for is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has impacted every aspect of life in the United States and around the world, and will likely reshape how many Americans vote in this election. So let's talk a little bit about voting in person. Secretary Pate, how are you approaching in-person voting given COVID-19 health safety concerns? I'm specifically thinking of social distancing measures and cleaning protocols and the number of poll workers. Just generally, what will voting in person look like, both if you can in Iowa or nationally?
Well, we had a good dry run, if you will, in our primaries. Each of our states went through those, some without any problems at all. Some had a few hiccups that they need to work through and improve on before the general election comes. And that was a great opportunity for us to prepare for it. For us in the primary, we consolidated some of our polling sites because we were concerned about getting poll workers, the actual people who need to do it, and locations, because most of our locations, frankly, were saying, we don't really want to do it. And we can't force them to do it. If a church says no, then they say no. So we did consolidate precincts in the primary, and we leaned on the absentee side much more aggressively. But the big difference coming into general is we've had more time to prep for it, and we've been much more aggressive. We have to recruit poll workers, as I said. We need about 10,000 in Iowa, and I'm pleased to say we've more than identified 10,000, but not necessarily enough in certain parts of the state. So we're keep working on that side of it. But I think the key thing here is we want to make sure the auditors have what they need to be successful on our local level. And with COVID, we've given them, as I'm sure Maggie's doing and most of my colleagues are doing, we're using the CARE money that we got from the federal government to make sure they have the masks, the face shields, the social distancing markers, for some, I know our state, we took advantage of Anheuser-Busch's donation of all the hand sanitizer. I just say, don't drink it. It's the hand, folks. But that's the kind of thing we had to do. And that for Iowa, I think it was over 2,000 gallons of hand sanitizer we're distributing actually next week. And that's a logistic challenge. And now I have it tough in Iowa with 99 because we've got to figure out how to get these all to the folks on a timely basis. So we're doing all those things, and we did a statewide mailing for absentee ballots at Labor Day. And we're doing that because we're trying to take the pressure off people going out and voting at our polling sites. If I could put a plug in, some of my colleagues, like in Michigan, they're using arenas, sporting arenas, because they have bigger cities like Detroit. So they're going to those large footprint, if you will, and I applaud that. We unfortunately don't have those kind of professional teams in Iowa. Envy, envy, envy. But we'll make do with what we have.
You beat me to it. I was going to ask you about polling sites, but naturally it came up. Secretary Toulouse Oliver, would you like to speak to in-person voting in New Mexico or nationally as well?
Yeah, and I'll just start by echoing, of course, a lot of what my colleague, Secretary Pate said. You know, and this is a way in which we all do very much come together as an organization because we have a lot of the same similar challenges. You know, I think one of the bigger challenges that we've been struggling with in New Mexico, and I know that a lot of my colleagues have been, is something that Secretary Pate was alluding to, which is this sort of balance between, you know, pushing is the wrong word, encouraging voters to take advantage of absentee balloting in the states where that is an easier thing to do because the states actually have some infrastructure built up for it, or they have laws that are very permissive with regard to absentee balloting, like my state and like Iowa. And then there are some places that don't, right? There are a lot of restrictions in terms of, you know, either the Constitution or state law. And there have been a lot of, I'm sure everybody on this call is aware, a lot of political battles over these questions, right? Over the course of the last few months. And so these questions have been in litigation. So we have to go, okay, but here's the thing. Voters at the end of the day, even in our states that have ample, you know, easy absentee balloting, there are voters who still very much want to go vote in person or need to go vote in person. We have people with disabilities that need that assistance at a polling place, or we have language minority voters that need translation services, or we have people who just simply want to go vote in person for whatever reason. So there has to be a really careful balance struck. You don't want to consolidate too much, right? You don't want to have too few polling locations, even though we know so many more voters in this election. In fact, I think we're going to have a record number of voters across the nation that are going to cast their ballot through the mail. That's just a simple fact of what we're working up to. But at the same time, it's incredibly important to make sure that we have enough polling places, that those polling places are engaged in COVID safe practices, that they have all of the PPE that Secretary Pate described. We too are taking advantage of Anheuser-Busch's hand sanitizer throughout the polling locations in New Mexico. So that has been a really careful balance. And last, I will say, in particularly here in New Mexico with regard to our very rural and tribal areas where it is really difficult, A, to get decent service through the mail, and B, to get to a polling location. And so as we have had to, in certain cases, either close or limit polling locations, we cannot do that in a way that makes the barrier even greater to access to the ballot box for those voters. So there have just been so many tricky balances we've had to strike anyway, and then you add the overlay of COVID on top of it, because we have, at the end of the day, to protect the health and safety of everybody that comes into a polling place, in addition to making sure they can cast their ballot.
Sure. And on a similar note, you know, my next question has to do with high engagement elections. You know, in high engagement elections, long lines have often been a problem. How do you expect to mitigate long lines and wait times with the added measures necessary to keep voters safe, you know, by sanitizing and social distancing? And what are you thinking as you look to Election Day? How will that play out? How about Secretary Pate? Do you want to kick that off?
Well, we see state secretaries and local county auditors being very creative. We have drive-through voting. We saw that in our primary, and we'll probably see some doing that if we don't have any blizzards in Iowa in November. But you know, and that's one way to, you know, expedite people going through at a quicker rate and not having to worry about the social distancing if they're in their vehicle. We have curbside voting that we have there for both handicapped as well as to access for people who just need that help. Those are steps. But I think the big one is we communicate to the public, ask for their patience, their understanding. And when you see a heavier turnout, whether you're an all-male state, but in our case, no-fault absentee voting state, we found we won't have the lines. We didn't have it in the primary. And we had a record turnout in our primary. And we had reduced our polling sites dramatically, whereas this time going in, we're actually, I feel very confident we'll probably be somewhere around 70% or more of our polling sites will be open. But we're leaning on potentially asking the National Guard to help us, to be more of a greeter and help facilitate the safe distancing portion of it. But you know, you're right. We don't want anyone having to stand in a long line. And in fairness to some of my colleagues, during the primary, some of them were getting a bum rap where there wasn't a long line to vote. People just weren't leaving the polling locations. And if I don't get the story right, Maggie, jump in. But our good friend in Kentucky, he's sitting here and everything's going smoothly, but they offered free food. Somebody was donating food at the polling sites. Well, people didn't leave. They came and they voted and they stayed. Well, then the parking lot was all full because no one was leaving. Those are unique challenges we learn from. So if you're going to offer free food, you better have plenty of parking. So we have to adapt is a polite way of putting it. That's what I'm seeing at least.
Thank you. Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, anything you want to add there before we move on?
Yeah, I would just quickly add that, you know, that's why you see so many states like Iowa and New Mexico trying to really up our game with regard to absentee balloting. Again, you know, the states that have been able to take advantage of either public education or mailing an application to registered voters, beefing up their absentee balloting processes are all doing it to the extent that they are able. Some states, you know, again, have some sort of limited options. You know, some are able to, you know, we're able to squeak out, okay, at least we can get a mailing out to, you know, all of the voters ages 65 and older, right, that are in the higher risk group, right? But all of those efforts have been geared towards trying to keep people voting safely from home so that the polling places that are open and available, A, you know, have fewer people going through them, and B, you know, that is a piece of being able to mitigate lines at the polling place. And the last thing I'd say is I know many of us, and we certainly are here in New Mexico, are doing what we can to educate voters to get that ballot cast as early as they can. If you have an absentee voting option, get your application in now so you can get your ballot in as quickly as possible. If you have early voting opportunities, go vote early. And that in New Mexico has been a tremendous help to contributing to mitigating lines on election day, because really election day in most states, that's really your last chance to vote. That's the last chance. And if you've waited till election day, and particularly if you go to the polls after work on election day, you are more than likely going to stand in a line. So we're doing everything we can to really just try to urge people, you know, go vote on the middle of a Tuesday during early voting so you don't have to, you know, expose yourself potentially to being in a long line.
Yes. And, you know, I do want to talk about mail-in voting. There has been conflicting information at the national level when it comes to the subject of mail-in voting and absentee voting. Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, could you clarify the rules related to mail-in voting versus absentee voting and what, if anything, distinguishes the two?
Well, they're the same thing. Voting by mail. If you vote by absentee, you are receiving an absentee ballot in the mail from your local election official and most likely mailing it back or dropping it off. I think the distinction, the semantical, you know, debate that has kind of arisen in the last couple of months has really been around the difference between a universal vote by mail state, states that conduct their elections entirely through the mail, such that every voter automatically gets a ballot in the mail, versus states like Iowa and New Mexico, where you have to request for that ballot to be mailed to you. And that's really the fundamental distinction, is that there is a specific request In my state, you have to make that request prior to every election. In other states, you can make that request for, a whole year's worth of elections, or you can be on a permanent absentee list. But the point being that you specifically ask as the voter to have your ballot mailed to you rather than having it automatically mailed. Fundamentally, in terms of the process, it's no different. The local election official is going to mail your ballot to you. You are going to receive it in the mail. You are going to in the privacy of your home. In some places, like in Colorado, you can actually just take your ballot with you to a voter service center and mark your ballot, if you want to use a ballot booth and feed it through a tabulator. In other states like mine, you can drop your ballot off at the polls or put it back in the mail. But again, there's fundamentally no difference with the exception of making that request on the front end.
Got it. Thank you. Still on the subject of mail-in voting, we got a lot of questions on the process. What is the process for verifying mail-in ballots, and how would you address voter concerns that ballots will not be counted due to inconsistent signatures, for example, or a missed mailing deadline? Secretary Pape, we'll go to you.
And this is one that there is going to be some differences from state to state. So I'll focus primarily on our state here in Iowa. First off, when you vote absentee in Iowa, you will request your ballot, and part of that process requires you to put your voter ID number on there, and that's our way of verifying. Signature is not the crucial component. It's only there as a mechanism that local auditors can flag, maybe to look at it closer, but it isn't the determining factor of whether it's a legitimate request or ballot. The voter ID number and the signature is required on there. And if for some reason they don't have those, the county auditors reach back out to them and tell them via the telephone, they qualify that they have the right person on the phone, and they make sure they get the information. And if it's a signature, they have time to correct that and get their signature in. We have very few of those that aren't processed. We have a pretty good success rate. We don't have a lot of spoiled ballots in that sense. So we're pretty comfortable with it. We're looking at typically, we'll probably get around 60% tops for a presidential election. And I suspect we'll be easily surpassing that. We could go as high as 80% voting absentee. But we also allow you to start doing that voting 29 days in advance of an election when you're doing absentee in Iowa. For our military overseas, they have 100 days. Which puts a real push on our county auditors, because printing ballots and getting it out there isn't easy. But we've done that, and I think it's a big win, because those who talk about U.S. postal challenges, trust me, you don't want to talk about what you're trying to get for postal when you're in another country, particularly with some of the challenges of COVID they're impacted with. So we've offered them that option. But the key thing here is, and for us, you can track your vote. When you put a request in for an absentee ballot, you will know by going online to my website when that ballot request was received by the auditor. You'll know when the ballot was mailed to you, and you'll know when the ballot was returned to you. So you can feel much better about that sense. And I think that's a big plus.
Yes. Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, would you like to speak to this as well?
We have a very similar process here in New Mexico, and in fact, every state has a similar process, and each state is going to be a little bit different in terms of what's required in terms of identifying yourself as the voter to apply for that ballot. Each state is going to have something a little different in terms of what is required to return and have that ballot accepted. Some states actually do a signature match process using special software and training of employees. Some states do like what Secretary Pate and I do, which is we have to have the signature there, but we're looking for other I personally identifiable information to verify the ballot. The bottom line is that no matter what state you're in, there is a process, there's a verification process. You know, ballots are not just being mailed out willy-nilly, nor are they being received back willy-nilly. And I think that, you know, it does a disservice to the election officials on both sides of the aisle who are working diligently to make sure that every vote counts, but also to make sure that the law is followed no matter what that law is in their state, to ensure that there's integrity of the process. So it's just really important for folks to know. Lastly, sorry, I know I was about to finish. None of this is done behind closed doors. these are all very public, transparent processes. The laws, the absentee board as it's going through its process. States have different laws about who can be present and who can observe and how you can observe. But that's something really important that I don't think a lot of folks know, is that these are all very publicly and independently observable processes. So none of this is being done in the dark of night. And so voters can have, I think, really high confidence.
Yes. Well, on the subject of confidence, and I think a segue, when you're talking about mail-in voting, the USPS, I'd like to take a minute to discuss the USPS and separately misinformation campaigns and how you're combating them to instill voter confidence. Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, it was reported that you recently led talks with the U.S. Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, to address growing concerns over how the U.S. Postal Service will handle what is expected to be, and you've both already alluded to it, a surge of mail-in ballots. What measures are in place to hold the USPS accountable, and when would anyone know, I suppose, if there are additional delays or shortcomings, for lack of a better word?
Sure. Well, this is a very layered issue, and one that I know many folks, particularly my own constituents, have expressed concerns to me. And here's what I will tell you, exactly what I tell them, which is, first and foremost, I've now been able to have 2 conversations with U.S. Postmaster General DeJoy and his senior staff, and I have been in ongoing conversation with my regional, state, and local Postal Service staff since well before our primary election here in New Mexico. And I think, to a person, there is an extremely high amount of dedication and level of commitment to ensuring that, in their words, election mail and ballots are the #1 priority of the U.S. Postal Service during this election. They have assured us that the volume of mail that they will be processing during this time is about a quarter of what they experience during their peak time, which is, of course, the holidays, right? So they know they have the processes and systems in place to be able to get ballots and other election-related mail where it needs to go. They have implemented some additional accountability mechanisms. And so, for example, in my state with my regional team, we see a daily report about ballots that are in the system, where they are and where they need to go. We also, and many states, utilize the intelligent barcode system to track ballots, like Secretary Pate was talking about what they do in Iowa, so that not only the voter and election officials, but the USPS knows exactly where every ballot is in the system at any given time. They are sending out a team of what they call ballot ambassadors to every postal processing plant across the country. And literally, that person's one job when ballots are out is going to be to sweep the plants on a nightly basis to make sure that no ballots have been left behind on accident. They've rolled back particular changes that were being made to the process that may or may not have actually affected their ability to effectively deliver the mail, but the perception was such that it could have had a tremendous impact. So, for example, sorting machines are no longer being removed, or they're being restored to their original location. Carriers are going to be allowed to engage in overtime to make sure they get those ballots out. And they said it'll even look like Sunday deliveries and going out on your route twice in a day, those kinds of things. So the accountability is going to be in regard to just the continued communication, right? We want to trust them and take them at their word. And I know in our states, feel like USPS is wonderful partners, but we're going to just be making sure by continually checking in with them. Okay, you said these ballot ambassadors were going to be sent out. Can we, see, where they've all been sent and what they're doing, that sort of thing. So I do feel highly confident in the U.S. Postal Service, but we are going to have to make sure that we work very closely together with them to ensure that no ballots do get left behind.
Sure. Secretary Pate, would you like to add anything on this subject?
I think Maggie covered most of it. I just underscore the fact that we have the barcodes, the IMB codes on the ballots. It tells us when those enter the process. So that takes the question mark about postal marks on, did you get it mailed on time to get counted? So those people who think, well, we hear about these votes all showing up 4 days after the election. Where'd they come from? And that's like, okay, with the IMB codes, we can tell them it was mailed before the election day. So this wasn't somebody going out at 12:01 and trying to do something they shouldn't be doing on an election. But I think that's important to understand. And I had a county auditor in our second largest county in Iowa. He did a test mailing and where he went to different quadrants of his county and mailed pieces out and got the delivery space they needed. So we're not just doing this haphazardly. We are working in tandem, and I'm very confident. I'm very confident in what we're going to see. But let's remind voters of this. We don't have overnight delivery. So, and people think this, I mean, it's sad, they do, particularly on absentee ballot requests. Now, I'm not so concerned about the ballot getting in, because if it gets the IMB code on it, we're covered. You got your vote in, great. But for those of you who want to do an absentee ballot request, you've got to know the deadlines to be able to get your ballot request in to allow the auditor to have time to process and get it back out. And for us, we have a deadline. We tell everybody, you know, there's an October date we have. After that, if you want to vote absentee, you need to go in person early to the county auditor. So we want to make sure people have what I call a vote plan. You have a plan for voting. And the first step is make sure you're registered to vote. And if you are registered, maybe you've moved, so you need to update it. We have online voter registration in Iowa, so you can do that. The next step is, how am I going to vote? I'm going to vote absentee, get that request in. And then as soon as you're comfortable on who you're going to vote for, mail it in. So that way you know it's got sufficient time. And you can certainly look up the progress. Most states are doing what I'm doing, tracking the ballot, so you'll know your vote got there. So you won't be scratching your head wondering like, okay, did it or did it not get counted? That's my tip, I guess, or suggestion.
Yes, thank you. Now, something I know that you both have focused on is combating misinformation campaigns. Secretary Pate, could you outline efforts by you and your peers to combat misinformation campaigns?
Well, that's a very big issue, frankly. During my tenure as president, we launched the program we call Trusted Info 2020, and it's very crucial because what we're trying to do here is to encourage people, and we're partnering with Twitter and Facebook and other stakeholder groups to encourage Americans to look to their trusted sources for election information. That's your local election folks and your state secretaries or election offices. That's where you want to go, because sadly, there is too much misinformation and disinformation out there. And they're coming from foreign entities, and some come from local voters spreading a rumor that's inaccurate. I like to tell everybody affectionately in Iowa, the Russians did not hack a single vote in 2016 election, but they did send out a lot of disinformation to create discord among Americans. And that's their goal right now. And I'm appealing to all of you who are watching us and listening to this. We need your help with this, because what they want to do is create doubt, and they want people not to believe in the election results. And that's just so drastic and can be devastating to us, because we have a great election system in the United States of America. We can't have people getting up the next morning going, that's not my senator, that's not my state legislator, that's not my president. And that happens, unfortunately, and social media is an ongoing challenge. And we secretaries wrestle with that, and we have all kinds of programs we use, but it's not something that you just snap your fingers and you deal with it. We have to have everybody's help on that front, and it will continue to be a big issue. So we need your help on that one too.
Thank you. And Secretary Sluse-Oliver, I know this is a priority for you as well. Anything you want to add?
Well, it absolutely is. And, you know, my hat goes off to my colleague for starting the Trusted Info 2020 campaign initiative. Of course, I carried it forward. I am carrying it forward with the organization because I would agree with Secretary Pate. This is probably the #1 issue we deal with. You know, I spend most of my time these days talking to groups like this or speaking to the media about the election and what we're doing to prepare and everything you need to know. And I spend probably a good half of that time talking about, you know, things that, you know, are misunderstood, that people have been misinformed about, and really encouraging folks to go straight to the horse's mouth. Go to your local county clerk. Go to your Secretary of State's website. If you can't find the information you're looking for, send them an email, call the office. I know that Secretary Pate and I and most of our colleagues are on social media as well. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, I'm even on Instagram. I don't know how to use Instagram because I'm a Generation Xer, but you know, these outlets are available for folks to get accurate information. But to Secretary Pate's point, this is a tremendous challenge and a tremendous problem. And we know for a fact that it's not just, you know, Uncle George or Aunt Sally, you know, that are passing along a little meme that they found online about voting that's wrong. That's the problem. We also know that we do have foreign threats that are, as Secretary Pate said, deliberately trying to feed the American public this mis and disinformation, either about voting or just about fanning the flames of, you know, the hot button issues of our times. I mean, if you're seeing a lot of stuff that maybe looks unbelievable on social media right now about maybe the death of Justice Ginsburg and the appointment process that's coming up, you are probably seeing something that was either created by or perpetuated by a foreign actor with the express intent of trying to further divide us as a nation. So to Secretary Pate's point, we each have an individual responsibility as digital citizens to check our sources, to not forward or retweet or repost information that we don't know to be accurate. And especially when it comes to how, where, and when to cast your ballot, to try to get that information directly from your local or state election official.
Thank you both so much for this helpful information and for your efforts on this front. Let's talk about election night and election results. This is an election unlike any other. When will we know who our president-elect is? You know, understanding that you cannot predict the future, could you give us a sense of what a realistic timeline is to have results? Secretary Pate, let's start with you.
Well, people need to remember election night results are unofficial. The election does not end on election day. As we talked about, absentee ballots, things like that come into play. There's provisional ballots that maybe have to be looked at to see if they're going to be accepted. But I can't control what the media does. And they, you know, for decades, they've always had exit interviews and they're always in a hurry to declare a winner. It's been a miracle to get them to stop doing it before the polls close. Because it's something worse than my four friends on the West Coast hearing, well, it's been called, it's so-and-so has won. And it's like, well, thank you, then I don't need to go vote. That's not the message we want to send. But the point I guess I get around to here is that for us in our state, at least, we're hoping to give unofficial results on election night. We've extended the period that our auditors can start processing the absentee ballots so they can get the paperwork done and be ready to tally them up on Tuesday. That's going to help us get ours out. Some states don't have that flexibility, as Maggie mentioned, because of the limitations in their laws. They have a lot of things that go on. So they don't have that ability. So they're going to take a little longer. And it might be a few days or a week for some of them to get the final number, particularly if it's a close election. But in our case, we hope to have that night, the unofficial, but then the counties canvass a week later, then the state does a canvass a few weeks later. So, you know, it's December, literally, before we're certifying the elections as official. But America wants to know who their next president is as quickly as they can find out, and other offices. And as candidates ourselves, we want to know when we run, did we win? Am I in office or not? So we share that challenge. But folks, the polls close at 9. Be a little patient. It's not going to be 9:05. You know, if CBS wants to call it, or ABC, or Fox, whoever else, that's their prerogative. But they're not always doing justice to the process, because there's a lot of things can happen when you have close elections in certain states.
Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, could you speak to this as well? And I'm also curious, could you speak to the process after someone casts their vote? What happens next? What's the process?
Sure. Well, I just want to quickly echo everything that Secretary Pate just said, and really double down on emphasizing the normalcy of the post-election process. literally every state and local jurisdiction does not have all the ballots counted on election night. That has never happened. It's never going to happen. And the reason for that is we want to bake time into the process to make sure that every eligible vote does count, right? And, you know, until we figure out a way to, I don't know, magically, you know, be able to process, you know, all of these last minute ballots that come in on election day and have them up at 9:05, like Secretary Pate is saying, there's always going to be this post-election process with accuracy and the outcome in mind, right? That is the #1 goal. We do understand that for transparency reasons and a variety of other reasons, people want to know outcomes, but accuracy absolutely has to be our #1 priority in counting ballots. And this is still very much a human process, and humans are susceptible to error, right? So we need to get it right, first and foremost. What happens after you cast your ballot? It depends. If you have cast your ballot at a polling location, those ballots are being tallied up right there at the site, typically with either a tabulating machine or a direct recording device. And the poll official board that's conducting the election there at the end of the night, when they close out the election, will be producing those results. Typically in most locations, of course, all of this varies depending on where you live. A lot of them will be posting those results very publicly, maybe right outside on the door. And they'll be taking memory storage cards that contain those results on them back to the central location for their county or jurisdiction to be aggregated into the totals for that county. Most states then also aggregate those results up to the state level. So what will happen in one of my counties is a polling place will close. That memory card will get delivered back to the county clerk. The county clerk will upload them into their total county results, and those total county results will get uploaded into our total state results. So when you're casting a ballot by mail, it's basically the same process, except that when your ballot gets to the central location where it's going to be processed, there's the checking that Secretary Pate talked about, where you have to look, you know, and make sure the signature's there, the voter ID number, whatever it is. You have to separate the envelopes because we have privacy of those mailed paper ballots. So we know that whatever's in here counts. Now we have to anonymize it and put it in a blank envelope away from the envelope that said whose ballot it was. And anonymize it that way. And then we take the ballot from the inner envelope, and then those get fed through a tabulator, and the same process happens with regard to how the results are transmitted. So just think about all of these different steps in the process, but the most important thing to know is that, again, none of this is behind closed doors, and you have bipartisan in every state, every jurisdiction, you have bipartisan groups of poll officials and county staff that are making sure that those results are safe and not tampered with at every step in the process.
And if I could just add to that,
Yeah.
most of us do post-election audits too. And that's part of what
We do.
we certify it. We want that audit done. And I think that's important.
Yes. So I'd love to take a minute to talk about voter education and secretary priorities. What your priorities are in this last stretch, and what voter education initiatives that you are pushing or rather working on, I should say. Secretary Pate, let's start with you.
Well, frankly, we never stop. New people registering to vote every day or being eligible. And that's why I tell people, you know, so you're never done. Yes, it gets ramped up during an election window, obviously. So we spend a lot of time on social media, both earned and bought, and whether it be traditional media, you know, through radio, television, newsprint, publications. But a big part of what we started doing, I think we started about 3 years ago, and that was our Voter Ready initiative, where we brought in all the groups who were interested in elections and people who wanted to help promote it, educating people. And we had a list of well over 100 of these organizations, and they have been our choir. They have been helping us put the message out. And we, of course, try to keep them informed. And so we're on the same, using the same hymnal, per se, if you will. And that has really worked well, because when we bring up new changes, like, for example, we were successful in changing the new law here in Iowa where 17-year-olds can register and they can vote in primaries in the state of Iowa if they'll be 18 by November. That was a big change, and we wanted to make sure everybody understood it and could make it successful. We also do things like kids caucuses, where we actually go to the schools and let young people have a chance to do a caucus. You know, caucuses aren't in textbooks because not all states do them. And we've had real success there at having thousands of young people get their first introduction to government that way. But we all try different programs and different incentives to try to give people the taste of why they want to be involved. I think a good one we just done is getting poll workers. We needed 10,000 poll workers in Iowa. And so we put a strong push out through social media. We did a statewide mailing to every active registered voter with an absentee ballot request. Well, included in that, we put an appeal to be a poll worker because we need help for that. Our poll workers are older group population, a higher risk for COVID. So we tried to tap into that as another way to get home run, if you will. We want you to vote, and we also want you to help out as a poll worker. So all these things are on the table, and I'm sure New Mexico has a lot of great programs going there too. I know many of our colleagues put a lot of effort into that.
Yes, Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I was excited to hear what Secretary Pate was going to talk about because he is like the initiative guy. He's got such cool stuff going on. I'm always so jealous because we don't always have the resources here to do as many of the kinds of cool things that he gets to do. Plus, he's just super creative. But yeah, of course, I think as Secretary Pate mentioned, all of our colleagues are really engaged in this voter education process right now. Many of us are really focused on talking to voters about how to vote absentee or by mail, since that's something a lot of them are just doing now for the first time this election. So for example, we're working on a series of just like little training videos to put up on our website and social media that walk voters through steps in the voting process and just try to break it down and distill it into some easy, easily digestible couple of minute clips that, folks can just use to help guide them, because so many of the questions that we get in our office and that our county clerks get are just about some of the most basic, steps. That what am I supposed to do with this other envelope? Like that sort of thing, right? So we're trying to push out as much information that way as we can. Of course, we're doing, a wide variety of advertising campaigns, including to sort of sub-communities that we have here in our state. So we put out a guide for our senior citizen facilities and assisted living facilities about how the caretakers of those facilities can help their the folks that live or reside there with how they can vote. But one of the initiatives that I'm the most proud of is that a few years ago, when I came into office, I stood up something called the Native American Voting Task Force, because members of our tribal communities here in New Mexico, which by the way, New Mexico, 11% of our population are Native Americans, members of our indigenous communities from around the state. So it's a huge percent of our population. However, they have much lower participation rates compared to their counterparts that are not Native, right? And so we have been trying to create initiatives around voter education that are language appropriate and culturally appropriate, because even within some communities that share the same language, they have different cultural approaches to voting and to how they talk about voting and what information you need and whether it's appropriate to have outsiders come into their community to help do that education, or whether it really needs to be somebody from within that community, right? So we've been working on a variety of these projects over the last few years, and this year we are doubling down on that work. A lot of our voter education actually has to go out through the radio in our tribal communities because we still have, there are literally thousands of people in this state that live in homes that do not have water or electricity. So, they don't have access to the internet. A lot of these communities are on the wrong side of the digital divide. So a lot of the way they get their information is by listening to the radio. So we do a lot of just literally recording folks who are speaking in that native language, talking about what the people need to know about how to vote. Here are the steps, here's what you do, just reading it out loud from a script, right? So we've had to get really creative in the era of COVID because most of these communities have been on lockdown. They have been the most susceptible to coronavirus, and the spread has been really out of control in those communities. So they've locked down to outsiders. So this has been a particular challenge, but one that we know, like all of these things, this is not you don't snap your fingers and get there overnight. These are long-term projects that we are continuing to invest in, not just around election time, right, but in between as well.
Thank you. Well, I see that we're coming up on an hour, and so the last question that I just want to pose to both of you is where should Americans go to review state-specific information for how to vote or how to register to vote? Moving forward, what's kind of the last word that we want to put out with the election? I think it's, what, 39 days away now? Secretary Pate?
Well, I'd say go to your Secretary of State website. Some states may have on a specific elections website, but I'd go to that, or your local county election commissioner, key ones. I want to put a plug in, if I can, before I give up my pulpit here, for what we do for those in the ADA community, because we've come a long ways on that front. And I want to applaud everybody who's been a partner in doing that. In Iowa, we have about 300,000 Iowans who are some way or another impacted. And not all these handicaps or the disabilities, I should say, are visible ones. So, we have to be real sensitive to that. But the key is we want to make sure voting is accessible to them. And we've doing a lot of things for making sure polling sites are accessible, curbside voting, the voting equipment is designed to accommodate their special needs, perhaps. In our case, we provided ADA tablets that will have a complete site information so they're all ready and can do it, checklists for them to do it. Our websites are for ADA. So it's a full picture here. We're not, we have a lot of different kinds of voters out there that we have to help out.
Yes, thank you. Secretary Cruz Oliver.
Echo everything. Once again, not a big surprise that my colleague from Iowa just said. And the last thing that I'll mention is that at NAS, we have stood up a site called canivote.org. It is a hub for all of the states that are members of NAS and our partners that are not necessarily secretaries of state, for every voter in every state in the country. If you go to canivote.org, you'll find out about how to register to vote in your particular state, polling locations, the absentee balloting or mail balloting rules are, et cetera. So that would be my last tip, just from a universal perspective. It's always best if you can just go straight to the source. Like Paul said, go straight to your Secretary of State or your county clerk. But if you're having a little bit of trouble navigating that or need more general information, please visit canivote.org. Thank you.
All right, canivote.org. I will be visiting it, and I hope a lot of other people do too. That concludes our town hall today. Secretary Pate, Secretary Toulouse Oliver, thank you for your time and for your tireless efforts to prepare for this election. To our audience, thank you for tuning in, and make sure you have a plan to vote. So thanks again, everybody, secretaries, audience members, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.